Hello everyone. In today's video we talk about the DSA, the Digital Services Act, a consequential law in the European Union. It came into effect in April 2023. The DSA aims to protect users by imposing standards for online platforms. They will be held accountable for illegal and quote-unquote harmful content. Also, the DSA forces online platforms to share how their algorithms work and to have processes to remove illegal content or goods. To summarize, the main goals, according to the European Commission, are better protect consumers and their fundamental rights online, establish robust transparency and clear accountability framework for online platforms, foster innovation, growth and competitiveness within the single market. Especially the last point is highly contended. So it's basically about content moderation. So which companies have to comply? The legislation defines digital services as a large category of online services, from simple websites to internet infrastructure services and online platforms. Just as with the GDPR, all digital services that conduct business in the EU are subject to the DSA, regardless of where the business is established, even small and micro companies, although the regulations are tailored to size. Moreover, the DSA defines very large online platforms. These are online platforms or digital platforms that have over 45 million users in the EU. So that's 10% of the EU's population. Platforms that are VLOP, so very large online platforms, include Twitter or X, Instagram, Meta, TikTok, Apple, Spotify, Microsoft and Amazon. So all the global digital players. Generally, the types of digital services subject to this legislation include online marketplaces, social networks, content sharing platforms, app stores, online travel platforms, accommodation platforms such as Booking.com, intermediary services such as internet providers and domain registrars, cloud and web hosting services, collaborative economy platforms. Basically, everybody that offers some kind of service to a EU citizen is covered in this legislation. The DSA also applies to gatekeeper platforms, defined as those with a systemic role in the internal market that function as bottlenecks between businesses and consumers for important digital services. These are, for example, Google and Facebook. In the Related Digital Markets Act, these gatekeeper companies are forced to give small businesses access to certain data in order to level the playing field. Very large online platforms, VLOPs, will also need to assess the risks their systems pose to public interests, fundamental rights, public health and security. This is similar to what we have seen in the NIS directive. At its core, the DSA is a regulatory framework that will impose rules around how platforms moderate content, advertise, and use algorithmic processes. Again, similar to the GDPR, under the DSA, digital services face steep fines up to 6% of the annual turnover for non-compliance. Obligations for intermediary services such as IPs and domain registrars or hosting services include transparency reporting, requirements on terms of service due to account of fundamental rights, cooperation with national authorities, points of conduct and, where necessary, legal representative. The regulations become more onerous for online platforms, which are required to follow the above obligations and also incorporate complaint and redress mechanism and out-of-court dispute settlement. Trusted flaggers, measures against abusive notices and counter notices, transparency of recommender systems, user-facing transparency of online advertising. Finally, VLOPs have to do all of the things I mentioned before and perform risk management obligations and crisis response, external and independent auditing, internal compliance function and public accountability, user choice not to have recommendations based on profiling, data sharing with authorities and researchers, codes of conduct, crisis response cooperation. As you can imagine, there is a certain criticism from the VLOPs themselves, but also from the scientific community. I'll outline the key points and address the criticisms raised in this paper. So first we have contrasting interpretations. So stakeholders have varying interpretations of the DSA. There is the so-called optimistic viewpoint that some expect the DSA to actually challenge the gatekeepers, so the large platforms with significant market power. So they believe it will enhance competition and actually protect users' rights. The more critical perspective, which I kind of share, is that the proposed obligations are a bit unjustified and overly burdensome. So concerns include potential stifling of innovation and unintended consequences, which would not be new in the EU. So the criticisms are mainly the overregulation. Critics argue that the DSA might impose excessive regulatory burdens on smaller platforms, also hindering their growth. The gatekeeper definition, so the DSA's definition of a gatekeeper is a bit debated. Some argue it should be more precise to avoid unintended consequences. You'll notice that I didn't give you concrete examples of what parts of Google or Facebook are the gatekeeping because it is actually not clear. Transparency obligations. While transparency is crucial, critics worry about the practical implementation of disclosure requirements. So you have to disclose what your algorithm does, which is obviously a bit of a golden nugget in your company. Content moderation. Striking the right balance between content moderation and free speech remains challenging, because who defines what harmful content is? It's easy to address illegal content because there you have a clear definition of what's legal and what not. Harmful is a whole other ballpark. Data sharing. The DSA's provisions on data sharing raise concerns about privacy and competition. And finally, the global impact. The DSA, if it goes anything like the GDPR, will affect the whole world. So the DSA's effects are probably beyond the EU, affecting global platforms and users anyway, but also might inspire future laws in also outside of the EU. So to conclude, the DSA's impact remains a topic of debate. Striking a balance between regulation, innovation and user rights is essential and very hard to do, obviously. Policymakers must carefully consider criticisms and refine the DSA to achieve its intended goals without unintended consequences. And that's it from my side. If you have further questions about the DSA or other regulations, please drop them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.